Food, like life, can be complicated. That's why I'm on a quest to learn all about our food and the crimes, issues, and debates that are tied to it. I hope you'll join me on my quest to explore the dark side of dining. GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, are one of the hottest topics of debate in the food world today. There has been a lot of effort to make the non-GMO label very sound, very trustworthy in stores, and it's a very hot topic where a lot of people have a lot of very strong opinions about whether GMOs are good or bad for us and what they really are. So I wanted to bring on an expert that has really experienced both sides of the issue. And I was able to find one in today's guest, Mark Lynas. Mark has been on both sides. He used to be super anti-GMO, and now he's got a much more nuanced approach to it, which we're going to get into later. And today's episode is a little bit different. We are doing a full uncut interview, which is not something we typically do. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Mark. Here's that conversation. Hello and welcome to the Dark Side of Dining. I'm your host, Kenny Mears, and with me today is Mark Lynas. So, Mark, for our audience, could you please kind of introduce yourself a little bit, like who you are, what's your background?
Well, hi there, Kenny. Great to be with you today. So I'm an environmental stroke science writer and campaigner. I've written several books on climate change. My latest book actually is on nuclear war and what that means. And I wrote a book about GMOs called Seeds of Science, which was published in 2018, I think, and published in the US as well, I think. So I've kind of been across a lot of environmentally controversial topics over the last, quarter century of my career.
Awesome. So as I understand it, when I was researching you, you used to be super anti-GMO, right?
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah.
So,
I mean, yeah.
Yeah. So, but now you're very pro-GMO, right? So
I'd say I went from anti-GMO to pro-science.
To pro-science, okay. So,
it's a new one. It sounds like splitting hairs, but it's actually an important distinction.
Okay, so could you give us kind of an overview of your story, that kind of change in perspective?
Yeah, so my original opposition to what's now called GMOs wasn't derived from science. It was sort of more kind of a gut feeling. And I think that's the case for a lot of people. There's this kind of yuck factor. And you see this in the way that, you get internet memes of like something which is like half fish, half strawberry and that kind of stuff. So the idea that you're like mixing genes from these very distant, unrelated organisms is, it just seems like a bad and unnatural thing to do, and therefore the result surely has to be bad for you in some way, right? And so I think it's based more on, and it was based more on that kind of yuck factor. Also, at the time, and this was like in the mid-1990s, the company that was producing the first commercially available GMO seeds was called Monsanto, became kind of a byword for evil, corporate evil, if you like, because they also produced this herbicide called glyphosate, which was to be sprayed on these GMOs. So like it was also seen to be taking agriculture in the worst possible direction, because it was, cementing monoculture and chemical dependent agriculture at the same time as doing something with the seeds, which meant that they would be controlled monopolistically potentially by these big corporations. And they were doing something new to our food supply. So like there was nothing good about it and lots of things to oppose. And so that's why we, in the UK and elsewhere, kicked off this huge campaign, which demonized GMOs forevermore, essentially. And I think, if you look at opinion polls now, most people are still scared and still think GMOs are a bad thing, even though scientifically turns out there's no evidence for that.
So what was the real kind of impetus for you changing your mind? Or at least being open to more answers? Like what kind of shifted your willingness to learn more?
it was because I was also writing on climate change, and I was doing a lot on, basically trying to communicate the science about climate. And I was talking about, peer-reviewed journals and, needing to be able to cite scientific evidence for things you're saying and stuff. And, it kind of occurred to me that most of what was being said about GMOs did not have scientific evidence and didn't have a scientific basis, and there was nothing in peer-reviewed journals or anywhere else to support it. So, the half fish, half strawberries, they were kind of they were fiction. And even the things that we said we were concerned about in terms of GMOs, actually, none of that was coming from the scientific community. I mean, it's a bit like vaccines, really. So it became except this was driven from the environmental left, whereas vaccines now is more driven by the kind of MAGA right. But either way, it's the same basis, I think, which is this sort of lack of trust and suspicion of institutions, whether it's science or government or anything else, playing with your food or playing with your, making you inject something into your body in the form of vaccines. I think in some ways it sort of foreshadows the populist surge that we've seen across, well, not just the Western world, but pretty much across the entire global political landscape over the last 10 or so years, ending with Trump and numerous other right-wing demagogue type government leaders around the world. And I think to some extent the GMO hysteria was one of the first signs of this big lack of trust, which ended up where we are today.
Interesting. So, okay, you've clarified that you're not exactly like super pro GMO, but you're at least like more backed by science. So what do you view as like the benefits as you see it from your perspective, right? Having come from being like very opposed to now you're not really, super anti anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's just that genetic modification or genetic engineering is just the technology. So like being against it makes no more sense than being against, I don't know, the wheel or the knife or something. Like knives can kill people. We better ban all knives. But actually, how are you going to chop an onion or prepare your dinner? So it's like technology has multiple purposes all the time. And new technologies, scare people, but they also drive innovation. They also drive innovations which can, give huge benefits to society. And overall, GMOs have been positive. So they've actually helped reduce chemicals in agriculture by replacing things like insecticides. And they've been able to give another tool to the toolbox, I think, of farmers and crop breeders to move agriculture in a more sustainable direction. But it's been tough, and there's lots of GMOs that have been banned or hampered or not happened because of the level of opposition, including in developing countries. Golden rice is probably the most famous example, which is a rice which is genetically engineered to have beta carotene in it, which is like what you need for vitamin A production, which is a big deficiency in some of the poorer countries in the world, particularly in young children. And Greenpeace and other NGOs who are against GMOs have always opposed golden rice, and it's still not available anywhere. So, if this opposition hadn't been there and if everyone had been supportive of it, it's the same as with vaccines or any other health intervention, really, that misinformation can lead to an outcome which, leaves millions of people worse off.
Okay, so really it could be a solution to pesticides, to some health issues, that's very interesting. So, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, the thing about it, you've got to be specific, right? So how can GMOs reduce pesticide? Well, it depends on the GMO, it depends on the crop, it depends on the pesticide, all these different things. So one of the first uses was insect-resistant crops, which meant that when the insect ate the crop, like the pest ate the crop, then the pest would die, and therefore farmers did not need to spray so much insecticide. So that's less chemicals in the environment and less chemical residue potentially in people's foods. So that's a good use of GMOs, right?
Perhaps a
Right.
bad use of GMOs, if you oppose the use of chemicals in agriculture, is herbicide-tolerant crops, where you could spray the herbicide on the crop and the crop would survive and all the weeds would die. But then that's increasing the use of a certain chemical. So it's like, as I say, it depends on the use case, and the outcomes are going to be different in different cases. But being anti-GMO makes no more sense than being pro-GMO. It's like, let's take a case-by-case look and see what this technology is being used for, and who's going to benefit.
I love that. I love that perspective. So what advice would you give to our audience about like being open-minded on topics where there's disagreement? There's often, maybe miscommunication, misinformation. How can people be more open to learning more about issues instead of just being like, this is what I believe and I'm not going to change my mind?
Yeah, I mean, you try and avoid being tribal about these things. And, I'm not sure where GMOs live now in the kind of political, cultural, culture wars. As I say, it used to be something which was on the green left. But then so was anti-vaccine sentiment. And in fact, there were often the same people in the same organizations involved. But the anti-vax stuff really has migrated now to the right of the political spectrum. GMO stuff, I don't know where it is. And I don't think it's actually that salient anymore. I think to a large extent, the kind of fear and superstition about GMOs has declined, and people have just moved on. And it's in the food supply in lots of different ways. And I'm not sure people care that much. So we've got a lot of legacy laws about GMOs in Europe. In particular, it's very farmers are prohibited from growing anything that could be termed a GMO in fields. So that kind of legacy of anti-science stuff needs to be got rid of. But that will take time, and scientists need to be able to persuade politicians, and ideally voters and consumers need to be able to understand what science says. But it's tough in a kind of polarized social media environment to get scientific messages appreciated and to get people to trust that that expertise even has a role. Like, this is the problem with a lot of scientific debates, is that people don't have the expertise, but that's not the same as saying you don't have the right to have an opinion. Right, you're not a trained scientist in something. You can't be. You can't be even scientists. You can't be an astrophysicist and a glaciologist and a molecular biologist at the same time, right? So your average molecular biologist has nothing useful to say about astrophysics, but they might still. So, and we're all of us, like normal people, are in that boat, right? We don't know very much about anything, science in particular. So it's really complicated, and you need a lot of expertise to understand these issues at any kind of significant level. But there are ethical issues that come up in terms of big companies, power. Whose benefits the technology is being deployed for. I mean, the AI conversation is probably the most immediate one of that. Like, whose benefits that? Who's benefiting? It's going to, I'm sure, create another whole wodge of multi-billionaires and so on, and that's making society more and more unequal. So all of these issues are all bound up together, and in a democracy, people need to be as informed as possible to be able to decide which side to take on these issues, scientific issues, as same as any other.
So really, just being humble enough to like look at the facts and learn as much as you can is kind of what I'm hearing.
I think so, but I'm not naive about this. It's not like there's a set of facts and there's a set of misinformations which are like easy to distinguish from each other. People share what they consider to be facts, and the facts on these things are contested. As I say, I've worked a lot on climate change, another very politically polarized issue.
Yeah.
So, from, let's say, the energy secretary in the US, Chris Wright, you'll hear one thing, that climate change isn't a big deal and we should be producing more fossil fuels. Same from Trump, obviously. Whereas from, most of the scientific community, they would disagree with that, and they'll say, no, it actually is a really, really big challenge. We need to get off fossil fuels if we're to kind of protect the habitability of our biosphere for decades to come. Pretty big issue, but, it's a political debate. And I think the same goes for GMOs. But if there's any level of facts that both or all sides can agree on, that would probably be helpful. But even that's difficult. I mean, like, they've put the nation's lead anti-vaxxer in charge of the Center for Disease Control. And, the health system in the US is in a state of near collapse as a result. This is what happens when, misinformation and polarization just goes too far.
Yeah. So you have obviously learned a bunch about the science behind GMOs and that sort of thing. So what resources would you refer people to so that they can learn more about GMO in particular?
Well, obviously read my book. I mean, which author would come on a podcast and not say that as the top of their list? Other than that, I mean, there's been a report produced by the National Academy of Sciences on this issue, which is pretty definitive. I mean, that dates back to 2016, I think, so it's quite old now, but nothing much has changed. I mean, the essence of the technology is the same. And also keep an eye on the way that things, are moving. There's new innovations all the time. There's CRISPR and gene editing, and I don't know how much you know about these issues, but so the classic GMO isn't really the cutting edge anymore. In some ways, actually, you'll have heard about the mRNA issue. A lot of the COVID jabs were based on mRNA technology, and also it's a very promising route for sort of personalized cancer treatments as well. RFK Jr. has just pulled the plug under that, so the US is not going to be in the lead in mRNA developments anymore, which is really sad. But that technology also came out of the whole kind of genetics GMO revolution. So, you just don't know what useful innovations are going to result from scientific work. And I think so. The key thing to do really is to support research funding, which is also being cut by the Trump administration, and try to, at least in the US, try to retain America's leadership in some of these cutting edge areas of science, which are being completely slashed to pieces at the moment by the administration. And I can't see why they're doing that. It benefits nobody. And the nation will be the poorer and will be less healthy as a result, sadly.
All right. So are there any other angles to particularly GMO issues that we haven't talked about that you'd like to bring up?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an open question how far GMO technology should be used in the natural world. Like, there's been some proposal because coral reefs are dying as a result of the warming oceans, and maybe we should genetically modified corals. And then do you want to release them in the environment then, and they can wild corals will then be genetically modified from there on potentially. So I think using GMOs in human agriculture is one thing because it more or less stays on the farm. Yeah. Whatever the crop is or animal or whatever. But if you're going to release genetically modified organisms into natural ecosystems, like there's, the other case was the chestnut tree in the US case where this had been wiped out by a disease, you might remember. And so they had a GMO replacement, which was resistant. Why not just spread that around, throw the seeds about, get the forests eventually to come back? Again, hugely controversial because people will look at the trees and go, well, that's not 100% natural. Yeah. And they'd be like, yeah, but it's not dead either. So, there may not be any perfect outcome there. And which is it that you'd like?
All right. Well, do you have any kind of final advice or word of wisdom that you'd like to share kind of as we finish up?
I mean, I'm trying to help build a pro-science environmental movement, if you like. We call it We Planet. And we've got chapters now going on 20 countries. So if you can imagine a kind of, pro-science version of Greenpeace, that's us. And I also run a podcast called Saving the World from Bad Ideas. And banning GMOs was a bad idea, even if it was one that I originally supported. But, you lose some credibility when you change your mind on an issue. Ask any politician. But at the same time, if you don't change your mind on an issue, then you're always going to be wrong. So that's, just... I guess the advice to people is to hold your opinions a little more loosely and check a little more before you insist that you know the truth about something.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been Mark Lynas, And we'll include some links to his book and the article as well that he mentioned in the description. Thank you all for listening, and we'll catch you later.
Cheers, Kenny.
The Dark Side of Dining is a production of Food for Thought Audio. This episode was written, produced, and edited by me, Kenny Mears. I'd like to thank today's guest, Mark Lynas, for sharing his thoughts and insights. If you'd like to learn more about Mark, go check out the links in our show notes. If you enjoy The Dark Side of Dining, you might enjoy our other shows. The Story Arc is a weekly storytelling podcast, which includes some really cool insights into folklore on our social medias. And our other show, Games 105, is brand new. We have some really cool college students talking all about video games, what they mean to them, and giving an overall cool review about them. So go check that out as well. We hope you enjoy listening, and be sure to follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And until next time, thanks for listening.